Blood-red roses lined the aisle of Oheka Castle, masking the scent of an ancient, terrifying secret. Rosalie walked toward her arranged billionaire husband, a massive, snarling rescue wolf by her side for protection. But when her fierce beast reached the altar, it didn't attack, it fell to its knees. Montgomery Wyeth Pharmaceuticals was bleeding out. After a catastrophic FDA trial failure in late 2024, Rosalie's father, Richard Montgomery, was staring down the barrel of federal indictments and utter bankruptcy. The family's century-old legacy in Boston was about to be sold for scrap. That was until Astor Holdings intervened. Nicholas Astor was a ghost in the financial world. He didn't appear in Forbes, he never gave interviews, and his photographs were non-existent. Yet his wealth was whispered to rival sovereign nations. He offered Richard a bailout that defied logic, clearing $2 billion of corporate debt overnight. But Nicholas didn't want equity board seats or stock options. He wanted Rosalie. Rosalie was 24, a fiercely independent art restorer who wanted nothing to do with her father's cutthroat corporate world. When Richard broke the news in the oak-paneled study of their Beacon Hill estate, Rosalie thought it was a sick joke. But the ink on the contract was already dry. She was the collateral, an arranged marriage in the 21st century, brokered by a reclusive billionaire who had only communicated through his razor-sharp legal proxy, Victor van der Linde. "It's 1 year, Rosalie." Her father had pleaded, his hands trembling as he poured his fourth scotch of the evening. 1 year of public appearances, a quiet annulment, and our family survives. If you refuse, thousands of employees lose their pensions, and I go to federal prison. Trapped in a gilded cage, Rosalie's anxiety mutated into a quiet, simmering rage. She refused to be a helpless pawn. Needing an outlet away from the suffocating wedding planners and the invasive NDAs she was forced to sign, she began volunteering at the Apex Wildlife Sanctuary, up in the Berkshires, a remote refuge specializing in rehabilitating dangerous predators. That was where she met Titan. Titan was not a dog. He was 160 pounds of timber wolf, mixed with something wilder, darker, and deeply untamed. The sanctuary had found him caught in a rusted bear trap near the Canadian border, half-starved and utterly vicious. He had already mauled 2 handlers who tried to change his bandages. The sanctuary director, Dr. Aris Thorne, wait-scratched that Dr. Aris Harrison was preparing to euthanize the animal. But Rosalie felt an inexplicable magnetic pull to the broken beast. They were both trapped, both sold out, by the world, and both fighting for survival. Against all safety protocols, Rosalie slipped into his enclosure one rainy Tuesday. Titan lunged, snapping his massive jaws, his silver-grey coat bristling with lethal intent. Rosalie didn't flinch. She sat in the mud, holding out a piece of raw venison, her heartbeat steady. She looked into his amber eyes and whispered, "I know what it's like to be put in a cage you didn't deserve." For a tense, agonizing minute, the beast stared at her. Then miraculously, he lowered his massive head, took the meat gently from her palm, and rested his heavy, blood-stained snout in her lap. From that day on, Titan was hers. The bond was instantaneous and terrifyingly intense. Rosalie paid an exorbitant fee to legally adopt him, moving him into the grounds of her family's estate. Titan hated everyone else. He bared his teeth at the maids, growled at her father, and snapped at the tailors who came to fit Rosalie for her wedding dress. He was her shadow, her protector, and her singular source of comfort as the dreaded wedding day approached. As November arrived, the details of the Astor wedding grew increasingly bizarre. Victor van der Linde dictated every element with chilling precision. The venue was to be Oheka Castle, a sprawling, isolated estate on Long Island's Gold Coast. The ceremony would not take place in the afternoon, but exactly at the stroke of midnight. There were to be no mirrors in the bridal suite, no garlic in the catering, and the guest list on Nicholas's side consisted of only 50 names, none of which could be found on any public registry. Rosalie felt a deep primal dread settling in her bones. She had never even met Nicholas Astor face to face. He was a shadow, a name, on a check, a looming threat. The night before she was to leave for O'Haka Castle, Rosalie sat on her bedroom floor, her fingers buried in Titan's thick fur. The wolf leaned against her, a low, rumbling growl vibrating in his chest as he stared out the window into the dark. "I'm not going alone, Titan," Rosalie whispered, her jaw setting with sudden determination. "If I have to walk into the lion's den, I'm bringing a monster of my own." The night of the wedding was a tempest of freezing rain and howling winds. O'Haka Castle loomed against the stormy sky like a Gothic fortress, its grand stone facade bathed in the eerie flickering light of 1,000 gas lamps. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent, yet undeniably wrong. Rosalie sat in the bridal suite, draped in a custom Vera Wang gown of ivory silk and vintage lace. The room was freezing. The heating system had allegedly failed, but the chill felt unnatural, seeping directly into her marrow. True to Victor's bizarre instructions, every antique mirror in the suite had been draped in heavy black velvet. Beside her, Titan paced the floor. The massive wolf was highly agitated. His amber eyes darted toward the heavy oak door, his hackles raised, a continuous guttural growl escaping his throat. "Easy, boy," Rosalie murmured, though her own hands were shaking as she gripped her bouquet of black baccara roses. At 11:50 p.m., her father entered the room. Richard looked pale, completely devoid of the usual arrogant swagger of a Boston CEO. He eyed Titan with outright terror and hugged the wall to avoid the animal. "It's time, Rosalie," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "But you cannot bring that beast out there. Astor's people will kill it." Rosalie stood up, the long train of her dress pooling around her like liquid moonlight. She clipped a heavy leather lead to Titan's collar. "Titan stays with me," she commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "If Nicholas Astor has a problem with it, he can call off the wedding." The walk down the grand staircase felt like descending into the underworld. As the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open, Rosalie's breath caught in her throat. The room was lit entirely by thousands of tall, weeping taper candles. A string quartet played a haunting, mournful rendition of a classical piece Rosalie couldn't name. The guests, Nicholas's guests, were utterly silent. There was no whispering, no coughing, no rustling of silk. They stood in perfectly still rows. They were impeccably dressed, strikingly beautiful, and universally pale. And as Rosalie stepped onto the red velvet aisle, 100 pairs of eyes locked onto her. Their gazes weren't warm. They were predatory. Titan went ballistic. The wolf planted his paws, baring his fangs in a display of pure, unadulterated savagery. He snarled a deafening, terrifying sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He lunged at the nearest row of guests, but Rosalie wrapped the leather leash around her wrist, digging her heels into the floor. Oddly, the guests didn't flinch. They merely watched the raging beast with amused, cold smiles. "Steady, Titan," Rosalie hissed, terrified but grateful for his aggression. He was the only thing making her feel safe in a room full of ghosts. She dragged the snarling wolf down the aisle, her father trailing fearfully behind her. Then her eyes met the altar. Nicholas Astor was standing there. He was breathtaking. He possessed a devastating statuesque beauty that seemed carved from cold marble. Jet-black hair framed a face of sharp, aristocratic angles. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo, but it was his eyes that froze the blood in Rosalie's veins. They were an unnatural, piercing shade of violet silver. As she approached, Nicholas didn't look at her dress. He didn't look at her face. He was looking directly at the raging, snarling wolf at her side. Who gave you permission to bring a dog into my home?" Nicholas's voice was like crushed velvet over ice, smooth, resonant, and dripping with an ancient authority that made Rosalie's knees buckle. "He's not a dog," Rosalie shot back, masking her terror with defiance. She stopped 10 feet from the altar, dropping her father's arm. "He's my protection, and if you want me to sign that registry, he stays by my side." Nicholas stepped down from the altar. He moved with a liquid fluid grace that defied human biology. He didn't walk. He glided. The temperature in the room plummeted another 10 degrees. Titan roared. The wolf snapped the heavy leather leash with a violent jerk of his massive neck. Rosalie screamed as the 160-pound beast launched himself directly at the billionaire's throat. Time seemed to slow down. Rosalie squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blood, the screams, the total collapse of her family's future, as her rescue wolf tore her arranged husband to pieces. But there was no scream. There was no impact. Rosalie opened her eyes, and the breath was knocked from her lungs. Titan had stopped. Mid-lunge, the massive beast had dropped out of the air like a stone. He was now flattened against the polished marble floor, inches from Nicholas's Italian leather shoes. The wolf who had mauled experienced handlers who had struck terror into the hearts of everyone he met, who bowed to absolutely no one, was whimpering. Titan's tail was tucked tightly between his legs. He crawled forward on his belly, his massive body trembling violently, and pressed his snout to the tip of Nicholas's shoe in a display of total absolute submission. A collective quiet chuckle rippled through the rows of pale guests. Nicholas Astor looked down at the shivering beast. A slow, chilling smile spread across his perfect face. As he smiled, Rosalie saw the gleam of light catch on something sharp. His canine teeth were elongated, razor-sharp, and completely inhuman. Nicholas knelt, ignoring his expensive suit, and ran a pale, ring-clad hand through Titan's fur. The wolf let out a high-pitched sound of absolute reverence. "You always did have a soft spot for strays, my sweet bride," Nicholas murmured softly, his violet eyes locking onto Rosalie's horrified face. He leaned in, whispering something into the wolf's ear, in a harsh, guttural language that sounded like Latin mixed with the scraping of stones. Titan immediately rose, turned around, and sat beside Nicholas, facing Rosalie. The wolf was no longer her protector. He belonged to the apex predator in the room. Nicholas stood up, offering Rosalie his hand. His skin was as cold as a corpse. "He recognizes his king," Nicholas whispered, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. "Now, Rosalie, shall we proceed with the vows? Or do you finally understand exactly what you've been sold to?" Rosalie looked at the door. It was closed. She looked at her father, who was weeping silently in the corner. She looked at the guests, whose eyes were now glowing with a faint, hungry red light in the candlelight. She was marrying a vampire, and her only ally had just switched sides. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling smart glass windows of the triplex penthouse atop Central Park Tower. At 1,500 feet above Manhattan, the storm looked like a swirling vortex of grey misery mirroring the absolute chaos inside Rosalie's mind. It had been 3 weeks since the terrifying midnight ceremony at Oheka Castle, and Rosalie's reality had completely fractured. She was officially Mrs. Nicholas Astor. She was also a prisoner in a gilded cage that spanned 30,000 square feet of Italian marble private elevators and priceless antiquities procured from Sotheby's. Nicholas had not touched her. Since placing a cold platinum band on her finger in front of a congregation of blood-drinking elites, her new husband had treated her with a distant, chilling politeness. They slept in separate wings of this penthouse. He spent his nights in a heavily soundproofed study, managing his vast invisible empire, while Rosalie roamed the endless halls completely cut off from the outside world. Her phone had been confiscated, Her father Richard had vanished into thin air, reportedly relocated to a secure estate in the Swiss Alps, his debts entirely erased by Astor Holdings. But the worst betrayal of all was Titan, the massive rescue wolf, the beast that had once snarled at shadows to protect her, was now completely devoted to Nicholas. Whenever the Vampire King entered a room, Titan would immediately drop to his belly, whining softly, until Nicholas acknowledged him with a pale, cold hand. The wolf still slept at the foot of Rosalie's bed during the day, offering her a shred of comfort. But the moment the sun set and Nicholas awoke, Titan's allegiance shifted back to the apex predator. Rosalie was suffocating under the weight of the unanswered questions. She refused to be a passive victim in a gothic nightmare. On a Tuesday evening, as the city lights flickered to life below, Rosalie marched into the East Wing. She bypassed Victor van der Linde Nicholas's terrifyingly efficient proxy, who doubled as head of security, and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of Nicholas's study. Nicholas was standing by the window, a crystal glass of dark, thick liquid in his hand. He wore a crisp white Tom Ford dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean, statuesque muscle. He didn't turn around, but a faint, amused sigh escaped his lips. "You are disrupting my conference call with the Vanguard Group, Rosalie," Nicholas murmured, his voice, a smooth, resonant baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. He tapped an earpiece and spoke in flawless, rapid-fire Japanese, then removed the device entirely. "To what do I owe this unprecedented intrusion?" "I want answers," Rosalie demanded, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it into a rigid command. She stepped further into the room, her eyes darting to the glass in his hand. The metallic scent of copper hit her nose, making her stomach churn. "I want to know why you bought me. I want to know what my father's FDA trial actually was. And I want to know what you did to my wolf." Nicholas finally turned. His violet silver eyes locked onto hers, holding a terrifying intensity that made Rosalie want to step back. He set the glass down on his desk. "Your father is a fool, Rosalie," Nicholas stated coldly, gliding across the room until he was standing mere inches from her. The temperature in the study plummeted. Montgomery Wyeth Pharmaceuticals was not developing a new cardiovascular drug, as the public filings suggested. Richard was illegally funding a black market genetics lab in the Berkshires. He was attempting to synthesize a universal cellular regenerator. Rosalie frowned, her heart hammering against her ribs. "A regenerator, what does that mean?" "It means he was experimenting on immortal blood." Nicholas hissed, his fangs extending slightly. "Your father hired mercenaries to capture my kind. He was bleeding them dry in subterranean laboratories, trying to extract our regenerative properties to patent a miracle cure for humanity. The FDA trial failed because human veins cannot handle the volatility of vampire blood. The test subjects didn't just die, they mutated violently." Rosalie felt the floor drop out from beneath her. "No. My father wouldn't. He's a businessman, not a monster." "Greed makes monsters of ordinary men," Nicholas corrected softly. He reached out his icy fingertips, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind Rosalie's ear. The touch was freezing, yet it burned her skin. "When the High Council of Vampires discovered your father's transgressions, they sentenced the entire Montgomery bloodline to death. An execution order was signed. You, your father, your cousins, every single one of you was meant to be butchered and hung from the Brooklyn Bridge as a warning to humanity." Rosalie gasped, tears stinging her eyes, as the sheer scale of the horror washed over her. "I bought his debts to seize the company and destroy the research," Nicholas continued, his voice softening into something resembling empathy. "And I married you, Rosalie, because the laws of my kind are absolute. The High Council cannot execute the legally bound mate of a vampire king without inciting a global catastrophic civil war." I didn't purchase you to enslave you. I married you to grant you diplomatic immunity. I kept you alive." Rosalie stared at him, her chest heaving as the horrific truth sank in. Her father had sold her to a vampire, not to save his company, but to save his own neck from a supernatural death squad. "And Titan," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Why does my wolf bow to you?" Nicholas looked toward the doorway. Titan padded into the room, his massive head lowered respectfully. The beast sat beside Nicholas, looking up at him with intelligent, sorrowful amber eyes. "Because Titan is not a wolf, Rosalie," Nicholas said quietly. "He is a lycanthrope, one of the last of the Appalachian pack. He was caught in one of your father's silver traps. The sanctuary you volunteered at was a front. They were keeping him sedated, preparing him for the dissection tables. I am the one who orchestrated his adoption through you to get him out of that facility before his forced human transformation triggered." Rosalie dropped to her knees, burying her face in her hands as the weight of the lies crushed her. Everything she thought she knew was a fabrication. But amidst the horror, a profound realization dawned on her. The terrifying blood-drinking monster she had been forced to marry was the only person who had actually protected her. Nicholas knelt gracefully in front of her. He gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look into his ancient, mesmerizing eyes. "You are safe here, Rosalie. The council is furious, but they will not touch my queen." But Nicholas was wrong. The attack came 3 days later, orchestrated with ruthless military precision. It was 2:00 a.m. on a Friday. Rosalie was in the penthouse library, curled up on a velvet chaise lounge, reading a first-edition copy of Dracula, a morbid attempt at understanding her new reality, when the entire power grid of the Central Park Tower failed. The smart glass went completely black. The temperature controls died. Then came the smell, ozone sulfur, and the suffocating stench of rotting meat. Before Rosalie could process the darkness, the reinforced steel doors of the private elevator were blown off their hinges with a deafening explosion. Smoke billowed into the grand foyer. Titan, who had been dozing by the fireplace, erupted into a frenzy. The beast didn't just growl, he let out a guttural, terrifying roar that shook the crystal chandeliers. His bones cracked audibly, his muscles expanding in real time as the lycanthrope pushed against the boundaries of his wolf form, sensing the lethal threat. 5 figures stepped through the smoke. They were dressed in tactical black gear, their eyes glowing a sickly phosphorescent green in the dark. They were not human. They were mercenaries, loyal to the Volkov Syndicate, a radical, brutal faction of the High Council that refused to accept Nicholas's protection over a Montgomery. "Kill the beast. Drain the girl." The lead assassin hissed his voice, echoing with unnatural reverb. They moved faster than humanly possible. One of the assassins lunged at Rosalie, a serrated silver dagger glinting in the faint moonlight filtering through the storm. Rosalie scrambled backward, her heart hammering wildly. But before the blade could strike a blur of midnight blue, slammed into the attacker. Nicholas materialized out of thin air. His aristocratic composure was completely gone. In its place was a creature of pure, unadulterated nightmare. His jaw had unhinged slightly, revealing rows of razor-sharp fangs. His eyes were no longer violet. They were a blinding, terrifying crimson. With a sickening crunch, Nicholas grabbed the assassin by the throat and hurled him across the 30-foot room. The mercenary shattered against a marble pillar, his spine snapping on impact. "Intruders in my home." Nicholas roared a sound that vibrated with ancient seismic fury. "You violate the sacred laws of the king." The remaining 4 attackers didn't hesitate. They swarmed him. What followed was a brutal, dizzying display of supernatural violence. Nicholas fought with terrifying grace, deflecting silver blades and delivering bone-crushing blows. But they were heavily armed with ultraviolet flashbangs, and liquid silver rounds weaponry specifically designed to cripple a vampire elder. An explosive round clipped Nicholas's shoulder. The UV magnesium burned fiercely, hissing against his flesh. He staggered, a rare sound of pain escaping his lips. Seeing her king falter, Rosalie felt a sudden, terrifying surge of adrenaline. She wasn't going to cower in the corner while he died for her family's sins. She grabbed a heavy, solid bronze sculpture from a nearby pedestal and hurled it at the closest mercenary, striking him square in the temple and throwing off his aim. It was the opening Titan needed. The massive wolf launched himself into the fray. He didn't bite, he tore. Titan clamped his jaws around the thigh of the mercenary. Rosalie had stunned, viciously, shaking his massive head and ripping the man down to the marble floor. The screams were deafening, but the lead assassin, seizing the chaos, bypassed both Nicholas and Titan. He leveled a customized silver-loaded magnum directly at Rosalie's chest. "For the council!" The assassin sneered, pulling the trigger. Time dilated. Rosalie saw the muzzle flash. She braced for the fatal impact, for the burning pain of silver tearing through her heart. But a shadow eclipsed her vision. Nicholas threw himself in front of her. The silver bullet tore through his chest, exiting his back and embedding itself in the oak bookcases behind them. The vampire king collapsed to his knees, dark, thick blood pouring from the wound, searing his skin as the silver immediately began poisoning his immortal system. With a roar that sounded almost human, Titan lunged at the lead assassin, crushing the man's windpipe in a single devastating bite. The remaining mercenary, seeing his squad decimated, abandoned the mission and threw himself through the reinforced glass window, free-falling into the Manhattan night to escape. Silence descended upon the ruined penthouse, broken only by the sound of rain whipping through the shattered window and Nicholas's ragged, wet breathing. Rosalie dropped to the floor, pulling Nicholas's heavy, freezing body into her lap. His skin was turning a sickly shade of ash grey. The veins spreading from the bullet wound were turning black, the silver poisoning him rapidly. "Nicholas." No, stay with me," Rosalie sobbed, pressing her hands frantically against the gaping wound in his chest. "You're a king, you can't die like this. Silver, near the heart." Nicholas rasped, his crimson eyes fading back to a dull violet. He reached up with a trembling hand, tracing the line of her tear-stained cheek. "I swore I would protect you, Rosalie. My queen. I don't want protection. I want my husband." Rosalie cried out the truth of her own heart, finally breaking through the terror. She had fallen in love with the monster who sacrificed everything to keep her safe. Titan whined, nudging Rosalie's shoulder with his bloody snout, looking frantically at her neck. Rosalie understood. Vampire healing required pure, potent living blood. Without a second thought, Rosalie pushed her hair back, tilting her neck to expose her jugular. "Drink, Nicholas. Take it. Take whatever you need." Nicholas's eyes widened, a flicker of raw hunger battling with his iron restraint. "No. If I lose control, I will drain you." "You won't," Rosalie demanded, her voice fierce and unyielding. She pressed his face against her pulse point. "I am your queen. You obey me. Drink!" With an agonizing groan, Nicholas surrendered to the instinct. His fangs pierced her flesh. The pain was sharp, but it was immediately replaced by a euphoric, rushing warmth that flooded Rosalie's system. She gasped, gripping his broad shoulders, as she felt her life force flowing into him. Beneath her hands, the horrific silver wound began to knit together, the black veins receding, as her human vitality pushed the poison out of his immortal body. When Rosalie began to feel lightheaded, her vision blurring at the edges, Nicholas abruptly pulled away. He gasped for air, his eyes glowing with renewed, terrifying power. He had stopped. He had protected her even from his own starvation. Nicholas pulled Rosalie tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair as she slumped weakly against him, safe and alive. Beside them, Titan let out a long, victorious howl that echoed out through the shattered window and over the skyline of New York City. The High Council had sent their worst to execute a collateral bride, completely unaware of the grave mistake they had made. Rosalie Montgomery was no longer a pawn. She was bound in blood to the Vampire King, flanked by a monstrous lycanthrope, and armed with the absolute knowledge of her family's sins. She was going to burn the council to the ground, and her king and his beast would gladly light the match. Did you love this dark, twisting vampire romance? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell, so you never miss out on our thrilling, supernatural stories. The underworld of the Vampire Council is vast, and Rosalie's reign has only just begun. Share this video with a friend who loves billionaire romance with a dark, monstrous twist, and drop a comment below. Would you have saved Nicholas or let the council take him? See you in the next chapter.